These are 50,000 Volkswagen workers who lost their jobs, not because of one bad decision, but because of the same bad decision made by different CEOs, repeated for 30 years straight. And here is the part that should make every car enthusiast paying attention right now genuinely angry. Volkswagen's own Works Council chair stood up in front of those workers and admitted that management still had no real product plan on the table. No roadmap, no clear idea of how to win back customers. The people making the decisions didn't have a strategy. The people losing their livelihoods were the ones paying for it. This is how the world's second largest automaker started falling apart, and why it's worse than almost anyone is saying. Before we get into how this came apart, you need to understand the sheer scale of what we're talking about. Because most people picture Volkswagen as the Golf and the Jetta, and that's barely scratching the surface. Volkswagen Group owns 10 brands: Volkswagen, Audi, Porsche, Lamborghini, Bentley, Škoda, Seat, Cupra, and Ducati motorcycles. As of the end of 2024, the group employs nearly 680,000 people worldwide. About 295,000 of those jobs are in Germany alone, spread across 10 factories. In 2023, the group brought in around $350 billion in revenue and made roughly $24 billion in operating profit. For context, that's more revenue than most countries produce in a year. This is not a struggling niche brand. This is one of the largest industrial companies on Earth. For decades, Volkswagen was the #2 automaker in the world, right behind Toyota, selling over 9 million vehicles a year. And for American car guys, Volkswagen meant something real. The Golf GTI, the Jetta GLI, the Tiguan, affordable European sport that actually had soul. The brand had genuine credibility. So, how does a company that size, with that kind of foundation, come apart this fast? It starts with a scandal that cost them more than $30 billion and revealed something much darker about the company's DNA. It's September 2015. The EPA hits Volkswagen with a notice of violation that shook the entire auto industry. Volkswagen had installed software in 11 million diesel vehicles worldwide, not a handful, 11 million, that could detect when a car was being tested in an emissions lab. The software would quietly switch the engine into a clean operating mode just for the test. On the actual road, those same engines were pumping out up to 40 times the legal limit of nitrogen oxides. 40 times. The total cost, fines, settlements, buybacks, criminal penalties, and legal fees across the US and Europe, eventually topped $30 billion. CEO Martin Winterkorn resigned. Criminal charges were filed in the United States and in Germany. Volkswagen's stock crashed more than 40% in just a few weeks. But here is the piece of this story that matters most for understanding everything that came after. This was not a few rogue engineers going off script. This was the direct result of a leadership culture that had been rotting from the inside for years. The man who controlled Volkswagen through his family's majority voting stake was Ferdinand Piëch. A German magazine once described the atmosphere under Piëch and Winterkorn as, quote, North Korea without the labor camp. Piëch was known for intimidating his engineers into delivering results. Winterkorn hated bad news so much that people reportedly made sure they only brought him good news before walking into a meeting. So, when Volkswagen's engineers could not make their diesel engines legally pass US emission standards, nobody told the boss it was impossible. They cheated because telling leadership you couldn't do something meant losing your job. That culture didn't end with Dieselgate. It just found a new project. After the scandal, Volkswagen desperately needed to prove it had changed. The answer, handed down from the top floor in Wolfsburg, was electric vehicles. All of them, all at once, bigger and faster than anyone else had attempted. They brought in Herbert Diess from BMW to lead the charge. Diess was a true believer. He went on CNBC and stated publicly that Volkswagen would overtake Tesla in electric vehicle sales by 2025. The money committed to that goal was staggering. In January 2021, Volkswagen pledged roughly $38 billion specifically toward electrification through 2025. Over time, total investment commitments across the group climbed to nearly $194 billion. One company, one bet, nearly $200 billion. Now, investing in new technology isn't automatically a mistake. But when you're making that kind of commitment primarily because you got caught cheating and need something to show regulators and investors, the motivation matters. Because decisions made from panic look different from decisions made from genuine strategy, and Volkswagen's desperation showed up in everything that followed. The centerpiece of Volkswagen's electric strategy was a company called CARIAD. Rather than licensing software from a tech partner or hiring people who already knew how to build vehicle software, Volkswagen decided to build all of its EV operating software from scratch, in-house. The result was a catastrophe. CARIAD burned through $7.5 billion in operating losses between 2022 and 2024. On just $3.5 billion in revenue. Think about that ratio for a second. They were spending more than twice what they were taking in, year after year. The software was so unreliable that the first ID.3 hatchbacks had to be stockpiled in parking lots across Germany, waiting for fixes before dealers could even put them on their lots. Launch dates for the Porsche Macan EV and the Audi Q6 e-tron were each pushed back by roughly a year because CARIAD couldn't get the code to work. By 2024, Oliver Blume, who had replaced Diess as CEO in 2022, essentially gave up on CARIAD and committed more than $5 billion to a partnership with American startup Rivian, just to get access to their electrical architecture and software. And by 2025, Volkswagen officially announced that CARIAD would no longer develop its own software at all. A company generating $350 billion in annual revenue couldn't build workable car software. That's not just embarrassing, that's a fundamental failure of judgment at the executive level, going back years. The CARIAD disaster was part of the problem, but the actual vehicles Volkswagen built for this electric future didn't perform in the market either. The ID.4 crossover was supposed to be Volkswagen's volume seller in America, the car that would plant their flag in the US EV market the same way the Golf planted it in the mainstream car market decades ago. In 2023, they sold about 38,000 ID.4s in the US. By 2024, that fell to 17,000. The numbers recovered somewhat in 2025 to around 22,000 for the full year, but that full-year figure buried what was actually happening at the end. After the federal EV tax credit expired, the fourth quarter of 2025 told the real story. Volkswagen sold exactly 248 ID.4s in the United States, not 24,800. 248 in a quarter. By April 2026, Volkswagen confirmed it was ending the ID.4 production at its Chattanooga, Tennessee plant entirely and converting that factory back to building gas-powered SUVs. Then there was the ID Buzz, the electric microbus that was supposed to be the emotional centerpiece of Volkswagen's EV lineup, the nostalgia play. The vehicle that would make people fall in love with electric Volkswagens, the same way the original microbus made people fall in love with the brand in the first place. Volkswagen paused production at the Hanover plant in September 2025 and cut planned output by 21,000 vehicles. The Hanover factory has capacity for 130,000 units a year. They were nowhere near using it. By December 2025, Volkswagen confirmed the ID Buzz would skip the 2026 model year in the United States entirely. These weren't fringe products. These were supposed to carry the brand into its next chapter, and they didn't work. While all of this was happening in America, something even more serious was playing out in China. And this is the part of the story that most coverage underplays. For decades, China was where Volkswagen made the money that funded everything else. In 2019, Volkswagen Group sold 4.23 million vehicles there. China was Volkswagen's single most important market on Earth by a wide margin. Then, the Chinese domestic auto industry caught fire and left Volkswagen behind. In 2024, for the first time in the company's history, Volkswagen was no longer the best-selling automaker in China. BYD sold 4.21 million vehicles in China that year. Volkswagen sold 2.93 million, a 10% drop from the year before. Volkswagen's market share in China had already fallen from 19% in 2019 to 14.5% by 2024. And by 2025, VW had dropped all the way to third place in the Chinese market, behind BYD and Geely, while Chinese domestic brands collectively captured 65% of total sales. Volkswagen's battery electric vehicle sales in China specifically dropped more than 40% in 2025. Volkswagen's China CEO Ralph Brandstetter told Fortune magazine that China's car market had lost all reason. He said Volkswagen would rather sacrifice market share than race prices to the bottom in a war they couldn't win with German labor costs. Herbert Diess, Volkswagen's China operations chief, was even more direct about the brand perception problem. Younger Chinese buyers now see Volkswagen as the brand for the parents. That's not a market correction. That's a generation writing you off. And when that generation is in the world's largest car market, it's an existential problem. Back in Germany, the weight of all of this came crashing down on the people who had no part in any of these decisions. In October 2024, Volkswagen management's restructuring plan became public. At least 3 German factories would close. Tens of thousands of jobs would be eliminated. Pay would be cut 10% across the board. The company's own Works Council chair, Daniela Cavallo, stood in front of workers and called it a plan designed to send tens of thousands of Volkswagen employees into mass unemployment. And she said something that cut right to the heart of the problem. There was still no real product roadmap on the table. No concept for how Volkswagen would win back lost ground. No clear answer to the question of what Volkswagen was actually going to build and why customers would want it. Thomas Schaefer, Volkswagen's brand CEO, added the internal admission that should have made headlines everywhere. German factory costs at Volkswagen were running 25 to 50% above where they needed to be. Some German plants were twice as expensive to operate as their competitors. Twice as expensive. Not 10% more, not 20% more, double. By December 2024, roughly 100,000 Volkswagen workers had walked off the job in warning strikes at 9 German plants. It was the largest industrial action against the company in decades. After 70 hours of negotiations, a deal was reached. No immediate plant closures. That was the line workers refused to let management cross. But the terms were still severe. 35,000 jobs eliminated at the Volkswagen brand alone by 2030 through buyouts and early retirements. That's more than 1 in 4 jobs at the brand in Germany. Annual production capacity cut by 734,000 vehicles, roughly the equivalent of the entire output of Volkswagen's main Wolfsburg plant. Wages frozen for 2025 and 2026. And the Dresden factory, a glass-walled showpiece that had been converted to EV production, stopped building cars entirely on December 16, 2025, the first German plant closure in Volkswagen's 88-year history. Then, in March 2026, Oliver Blume announced the total wasn't 35,000. It was 50,000 across the whole group, including Audi, Porsche, and what was left of CARIAD. The 2025 financial results confirmed everything. Operating profit fell 53% in a single year, from roughly $24 billion in 2023 down to approximately $9.6 billion in 2025. Net profit dropped 44%. Porsche, which had always been the brand that could weather anything, the crown jewel that was supposed to be financially bulletproof, saw its operating margin collapse from around 15% to nearly nothing, posting an annual profit of barely $100 million on a brand that had been generating billions of dollars a year. Meanwhile, CEO Oliver Blume collected roughly $8 million in compensation while announcing the 50,000 job cuts. Workers' representatives made the point that couldn't be ignored. The company was still generating cash. This wasn't a company that had run out of money. This was a company choosing to cut 50,000 jobs while continuing to pay its executives tens of millions of dollars per year. Here's what separates this from just a bad earnings cycle, and why it matters beyond Volkswagen. The culture that produced Dieselgate, where engineers couldn't tell leadership that something was physically impossible, is the exact same culture that produced a software division that burned through $7.5 billion without delivering working code. It's the same culture that committed $194 billion to an electric future while losing control of its most important market. And it's the same culture that, according to its own Works Council chair, still had no coherent product plan, while tens of thousands of workers were being handed their walking papers. Different CEOs, same result. Winterkorn built a culture where bad news couldn't reach the top floor. Diess committed nearly $200 billion to a strategy the company couldn't execute, and Blume is the one left holding the bill, announcing 50,000 job cuts and asking everyone to trust that there's a real plan this time. Volkswagen still has cash. It still has engineering talent. It still has brands that people around the world genuinely care about. That's not nothing. That's actually a real foundation to build from. But 50,000 workers are losing their livelihoods through 2030. And the pattern that caused this? Leadership deciding from the top floor what the market should want, instead of listening to what the market is actually telling them. That pattern has repeated itself at this company across 3 different scandals, 3 different CEOs, and 3 decades. Their next earnings report is due this summer of 2026. Whatever numbers come out of Wolfsburg, I'll be here to break them down. Subscribe so you don't miss it.